Every night, just before the last light faded behind the mountains, a tiny figure curled up outside a weathered old cabin deep in the woods. She was no bigger than a pine cone, wild in her eyes and trembling from the cold. But what no one knew, not even the woman inside, was that this wasn't just any stray kitten. She was a whisper from the forest, and the forest was about to whisper back. What unfolded between a grieving woman and a creature of the wild would move the earth beneath their feet and leave behind a message nature never forgets. The stranger on the firewood pile. The Blue Ridge Mountains rose like ancient sentinels around Eleanor Rayner's cabin, quiet, steady, and unknowable. Tucked 5 miles off the main road, at the end of a narrow gravel path barely wide enough for her old pickup, the cabin stood in quiet defiance against the modern world. No cell phone towers reached this far. No neighbors dropped by unannounced. It was the kind of place where the only clock was the sun, and that was exactly why she'd chosen it. Ellie was 42, with a face that carried a softness hardened slightly by loss. Her auburn hair was usually tied back beneath a knit beanie, and her boots were caked in the red-brown earth that made up most of the mountain trail. Since leaving behind her career as a photojournalist, she'd taken up nature photography, documenting wildflowers and birdsong instead of war zones and famine. But even the lens couldn't quite soften the edges of the ache she carried. It had been 2 years since she buried her husband Daniel. They'd been documentary filmmakers, partners in work and in life, until a sudden avalanche in Alaska stole him from a landscape they both loved. After the funeral, Ellie packed her cameras, sold the apartment in Asheville, and disappeared into the mountains. Her grief needed space to breathe, and so did she. Each morning began the same way. Strong coffee brewed over an old propane stove, the crackle of firewood in the hearth, and the sweet, pine-laced air pouring through her front porch screen. Her days were simple. She hiked, wrote, and occasionally submitted her photos to quiet little journals that appreciated the poetry of stillness. The nights, however, were lonelier. The forest around her was alive, but silent. She saw deer tracks in the frost, heard owls call across the hollow, and once glimpsed a black bear lumbering through a thicket. Still, none of it quite filled the space Daniel had left behind. Then, one morning in mid-October, something shifted. Ellie stepped out onto her porch with a steaming mug in hand, only to pause mid-step. There, on the far side of the firewood pile, lay a tiny, fur-covered shape. She blinked, thinking perhaps it was just a squirrel or a shadow. But it moved, a kitten, small, ragged, curled into itself like a leaf caught in the wind. Its fur was a messy tangle of tawny gold, streaked with dark stripes down its back. She couldn't tell if it was sleeping or just too weak to run. Ellie took one quiet step forward, careful not to startle it. The kitten's ears twitched, but it didn't flee. It simply opened one eye, an arresting, glassy blue, and stared. That stare would stay with her. She whispered, "Where did you come from?" The kitten said nothing, only blinked once and tucked its head tighter into its paws. The forest was watching. Ellie could feel it. And for the first time in 2 years, something stirred inside her too. The first encounter. Ellie stood motionless on the porch, coffee forgotten, as the kitten continued to lie there, silent, unmoving. The way it curled into itself, tail tucked, body taut like a coiled spring, told her everything. It didn't trust her. Not yet. She backed away slowly, leaving the door cracked open behind her as she stepped into the cabin. From the fridge, she pulled out a slice of leftover roast chicken. With gentle hands, she tore it into shreds and placed them on an old ceramic plate. No fanfare. No sudden movements. She slid the plate to the edge of the porch, a few feet from the woodpile. The kitten didn't move. Not for an hour. Not until Ellie had returned to her seat by the fireplace, watching through the screen door like someone waiting for a ghost to blink. Finally, just before dusk, the kitten rose on shaky legs, approached the plate and began to eat, quietly, desperately. Every crunch echoed in Ellie's chest. It didn't linger afterward. As soon as the food was gone, it disappeared into the underbrush like mist pulled back into the trees. No sound, no trace, just a hollow space where it had been. That night, Ellie sat by the window long after dark, her journal open but untouched. A single sentence sat at the top of the page. "There's something wild outside that doesn't feel like a stranger." The next morning, the plate was empty again, and again the next. Ellie began to leave food out regularly. Scraps of fish, cooked eggs, warm milk in a chipped mug. And each evening the kitten came back, always after twilight, always when the forest began to hum in that low, whispering way. After a week she named it. "Whisker," she murmured through the window glass one night. "You don't belong to anyone, do you?" The name stuck, though the kitten never came close enough for her to say it to its face. Whisker never meowed, never purred. He simply existed, a sliver of something ancient and mysterious that had chosen, inexplicably, to share space with her. There were clues, too. His build was sturdier than a typical house cat, his ears slightly tufted at the tips, his paws broad. His eyes, now shifting from blue to a deep amber, seemed older than any kitten should carry. "Not a house cat," Ellie whispered to herself one morning. "You're something else." Still, she didn't say anything to the townsfolk, not even to Mary at the general store, who always asked how the mountain life was treating her. Ellie couldn't explain why. Maybe it was fear someone would trap him. Or maybe it felt too sacred to share. Then, one night, as the first frost glazed the porch rails, Whisker didn't leave after he ate. He curled into the corner beneath her rocking chair, tail wrapped around himself, golden fur rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. Ellie didn't move. She only watched, heart thudding quietly, as something long dormant inside her began to thaw. The forest had sent a message, and it had found its way home. Shared silences in the wild. The days that followed were filled with a new kind of rhythm, one Ellie hadn't expected and didn't know she needed. Each morning she would check the porch and find faint prints in the dew. Small, wide-padded, and unmistakably feline. Sometimes the chicken bones were scattered. Sometimes the milk mug was tipped. But one thing remained constant. Whisker had returned. And not just for food anymore. One morning, Ellie opened the door and found him stretched across the porch railing, sunning himself as if it were the most natural thing in the world. His golden coat caught the morning light, and his black ear tufts twitched with every gust of breeze. When she stepped outside, he didn't run. He simply blinked at her, slow, deliberate, and then turned his face back to the trees. That was the first time she felt it. Trust. It didn't come with wagging tails or purring affection. Whisker was no dog, no pet cat. He was a creature born of pine needles and river stones, and he carried the forest in his spine. But each day, he lingered a little longer, moved a little closer. Once, Ellie dropped a piece of venison from her lunch plate, and it landed just a few feet from her boots. Whisker patted over and ate it in silence, his eyes never leaving hers. It felt like communion. Ellie started talking to him, casually at first, the way someone talks to a photograph or a ghost. She spoke of Daniel, of their expeditions in Patagonia, the time they got caught in a sandstorm in Morocco, the snow that never stopped in Denali. She told Whisker about the last photo Daniel ever took, a glacier illuminated by the northern lights, and how it had won awards but felt, to her, like a goodbye. She didn't expect understanding. She didn't expect anything. But Whisker listened. Or at least he stayed. And that was more than most had done in a long time. Some days, She'd catch him watching her from the tree line, his form barely visible among the shifting colors of autumn, tawny gold and earthen brown vanishing among the falling leaves. Other times, he'd sleep just under the steps, his body half in shadow, as though still unsure if this space was truly his. Ellie started sketching again. Not for work, not for a publication, just for herself. Pages filled with Whisker's eyes, his crouch, the angle of his body when he crept along the porch rail. She drew the woods too, the way the branches bent in the wind, the pile of shed deer antlers she'd found behind the cabin, the way the fog hung over the river in the early hours. One afternoon, as golden leaves fluttered like confetti across the clearing, Ellie caught herself smiling, really smiling, as Whisker chased a moth near the woodpile. His movements were clumsy and sudden, still too young to master the elegance he would one day grow into. And in that moment, the air didn't feel so heavy. But peace, as she had learned, was a fragile thing. That night, a noise shattered the stillness. A gunshot, sharp, close, echoing off the ridge like a warning. Whisker vanished into the trees so fast Ellie barely saw him go. Her heart pounded as she stepped onto the porch, eyes scanning the black woods. In the distance, the sound of a four-wheeler engine hummed against the hush of the night. Ellie's jaw clenched. She knew who it was, Dave Whelan, and she had a sinking feeling he'd seen something he didn't understand. You don't tame the wild. You respect it. The next morning, Ellie's boots crunched on the frost-covered grass as she stepped off her porch, scanning the tree line for any sign of Whisker. No paw prints, no movement. The food she'd left out the night before remained untouched. The silence wrapped tighter than usual, like the forest itself was holding its breath. She didn't have to wait long to find out why. Around noon, the rumble of a four-wheeler broke the stillness. Ellie's heart sank even before she saw him. Dave Whelan, her nearest neighbor, emerging from the trail, wearing his usual flannel jacket and grease-stained jeans. The back of his vehicle held a cooler, some rope, and what looked like a hunting bow strapped across the seat. He pulled up and cut the engine. "Morning, Ellie," he called, swinging a leg over and dropping to the ground. "Cold one last night." Ellie nodded, cautious. "Sure was." Dave was in his late 50s, with a face weathered like old leather and a beard that seemed to have swallowed his neck. He had lived out here longer than anyone and liked to remind everyone of it. Ellie had only spoken to him a handful of times, mostly when he dropped off her mail from the box at the base of the mountain road. He wasn't cruel, but he wasn't kind either, just hard, like everything else up here. He pointed toward the woods behind her cabin. "Spotted something unusual on my trail cam last night. Thought I'd stop by, see if you've seen it too." Ellie's spine tightened. "What kind of something?" "Looked like a bobcat," he said, eyes narrowing slightly. "Young, real young, but bold. Was sniffing around my deer blind." She kept her face neutral. "That's not unusual out here." "True," he said slowly. "But this one didn't look right. Didn't act right either. It was alone, out in the open, seemed too used to people." Ellie's stomach twisted. "So what?" Dave stepped closer, his boots sinking into the damp soil. "So, that kind of animal's dangerous. You think it's cute now, but give it another few months. Bigger paws, longer fangs, no fear. That's the kind that shows up on someone's porch and doesn't leave." Ellie crossed her arms. "Maybe it's just trying to survive. Or maybe someone's been feeding it," he said, his voice edged now, his gaze cutting into her like a blade. "Making it forget what it is." She didn't answer. Dave glanced toward the side of her cabin, where the corner of a ceramic plate peeked from under the porch swing. His jaw tightened. "You know the law, Ellie. Bobcats are game, protected if they're in the wild. But if one gets too close to people, Fish and Wildlife won't wait long before they put it down." Ellie swallowed hard. That won't be necessary." He looked at her a beat too long. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small metal flash drive. "Here," he said. "Trail cam footage. Thought you might want to see what's been sniffing around." She took it silently, her hand brushing his calloused fingers. He turned back toward the four-wheeler. "I ain't looking for trouble," he said over his shoulder. "But I've got grandkids that visit me on weekends, and I don't take chances with wild things that forget they're wild." Ellie stood in the cold long after he drove away, the engine fading into the hush of pine needles and crow calls. Later, inside the cabin, she plugged the drive into her old laptop. The footage flickered to life. Grainy night vision shots of trees, shadows, raccoons, then, unmistakably, Whisker. His golden coat flashed in the infrared, his eyes glowing as he padded silently toward the camera. He paused, sniffed the lens, then sat down as if waiting for someone. And in that moment, Ellie saw what Dave couldn't. Not a threat, not a mistake, just a young creature trying to find where he belonged. She closed the laptop and exhaled. But deep in her gut, she knew Dave wasn't wrong. Not entirely. As Whisker grew, so would the risk, and if anyone else spotted him. The next shot might not come from a trail cam. When the forest came inside, the wind had shifted. Ellie felt it in her bones before the storm ever touched the mountains. By late afternoon, thick clouds had rolled in from the northwest, tumbling over the peaks like smoke from a distant fire. The trees groaned under the growing pressure, and the air carried a strange, electric weight. She stacked firewood higher than usual that evening, double-checked the propane, and laid towels by the door to keep the cold from sneaking in. As she moved through her preparations, her eyes drifted toward the forest again and again. Still, no sign of Whisker. He hadn't returned since Dave's visit the morning before. The food had gone untouched. The porch was bare. Every part of her wanted to believe he was just off somewhere, curled in a hollow tree or trailing a scent through the ravine. But doubt had a way of getting under the skin, especially when the woods felt too quiet. By nightfall, the wind came in howling. Branches slapped against the roof like thrown stones. Rain followed soon after, sharp and sideways, slapping against the cabin's windows. Thunder rumbled through the valleys, shaking the panes. Ellie lit 2 lanterns and sat cross-legged on the floor with her sketchbook, trying to distract herself. She was halfway through a pencil rendering of Whisker's face, those wide, fire-colored eyes, when she heard it. A sound, not the wind, not the rain. Something softer, scraping. It came again, this time accompanied by a low, almost inaudible cry. Ellie rose to her feet, heart thumping. She grabbed her flashlight and moved slowly toward the front door. The storm bellowed on the other side, rattling the frame. She hesitated, then opened it. The wind surged in, icy and furious. But in the middle of the chaos, something small crouched beneath the steps. Whisker. He was soaked to the bone. His fur clung to his small frame, muddy and trembling. His ears were pinned flat, eyes wide, with a kind of fear she'd never seen in him before. Not fear of her, fear of being left out. "Oh, sweetheart," Ellie whispered, already dropping to her knees. "You came back." She reached her hand out slowly. Whisker didn't bolt. Instead, he dragged himself forward, inch by inch, his paws barely making a sound on the wood. When he finally crossed the threshold of the cabin, his legs gave out. He collapsed on the rug by the door. Without thinking, Ellie grabbed one of her thick bath towels and knelt beside him. She wrapped him gently, blotting the water from his coat. He didn't resist. He didn't flinch. He just breathed, short, shallow, exhausted. When he looked up at her, something in those amber eyes broke her heart clean open. She spoke softly as she worked. "You're okay now. You're safe here. I won't let anything happen to you." Outside, the storm roared on. Inside, a wild animal lay curled in her home, wrapped in a human towel, trusting a human touch. For hours, Ellie sat beside him, a hand resting on his side, feeling each breath. His body twitched now and then, little spasms from cold or nerves or dreams. She didn't know. She only knew he was there, and he'd chosen her cabin, out of all the places in the vast forest, to weather the storm. Later that night, after the fire had died down to embers and the wind had softened to a whimper, Whisker lifted his head and stood. He padded across the room, no longer shaking, and hopped onto the worn couch cushion next to her. He circled twice, just like Daniel used to do before climbing into his sleeping bag during their expeditions, and then collapsed beside her, his body pressed against her hip. Ellie didn't move, didn't speak. She just laid her hand lightly on his back and closed her eyes. Outside, the storm had passed. But inside that cabin, a different storm, the one inside her, had begun to quiet too. Through thorns and snow. The morning after the storm, the world looked scrubbed clean. The rain had scoured the forest, leaving everything glistening and heavy with dew. Sunlight broke through the clouds in slanted golden beams, and the air carried that crisp scent of pine, earth, and something faintly metallic. Ellie stepped out onto the porch with a mug of coffee warming her palms. She glanced down, expecting to see Whisker curled up in his usual spot, but he wasn't there. Her heart ticked faster. She checked the spot beneath the stairs. Empty. Then the tree line. Still. She called his name softly, once, twice. No answer. Her boots hit the wet ground before she even realized she was moving. It wasn't unusual for Whisker to disappear for hours, sometimes days. But something about this morning felt off. Maybe it was how he'd clung to her the night before. Maybe it was the way the forest birds had gone quiet. Or maybe it was just instinct, the kind she'd learned to trust in the field, the kind that told her when something was wrong before the facts caught up. She followed the path behind her cabin that led toward a ravine where Whisker often roamed. His paw prints dotted the muddy trail, fresh, spaced close together, like he'd been walking slowly. Wounded, maybe. Her breath came faster. About a quarter-mile in, she heard it, a rustling in the underbrush, followed by a sharp, almost strangled cry. Then silence. Ellie broke into a run. She pushed through ferns and low-hanging branches until she stumbled into a small clearing where the scent of rust and blood hung thick in the air. And there he was, Whisker, trapped. A steel-jawed leg-hold trap clamped tightly around his back right paw. His body lay half-curled, flanks heaving with effort. Blood seeped between the teeth of the metal. His eyes were wide with pain, but still locked on her. Recognition and trust buried beneath terror. Ellie dropped to her knees, barely registering the sting of nettles across her shins. "It's okay. I'm here," she whispered, her voice shaking. Whisker hissed. Not at her, but at the pain. He tried to shift, but the trap pulled at his flesh, drawing another sharp yowl from deep in his chest. Ellie gritted her teeth and reached into her camera bag. She always carried a multi-tool, a habit left over from her photojournalist days. Hands trembling, she pried at the springs, trying to remember every YouTube video she'd ever watched about releasing traps. It took 2 tries. The third, the jaws gave way with a violent snap, and Whisker jerked back, whimpering, as he dragged his injured leg close to his body. Ellie didn't hesitate. She wrapped him in her flannel overshirt and cradled him against her chest like a child. "It's going to be okay," she said, tears blurring the trail ahead as she carried him home through the broken light. Behind her, the metal trap lay in the mud, silent, open, waiting. A bond beyond taming. Whisker didn't move much over the next few days. Ellie kept him swaddled in a folded wool blanket beside the fireplace, his injured leg cleaned, wrapped, and carefully elevated. Her vet friend, Maggie, from the town 30 miles down the road, drove up the mountain in her beat-up Subaru after Ellie left a breathless message on her voicemail. "Are you sure this is a bobcat?" Maggie asked, as she leaned in close, examining Whisker's broad paws, the thick tufts on his ears, and the rough pads beneath them. "He's young, but this isn't a stray kitten, Elle. This is a wild animal. You've been sheltering a predator." Ellie nodded, stroking his fur gently. "I know, but he's never tried to hurt me, not once." Maggie didn't argue. She just sighed and injected a mild sedative so she could properly clean the wound. "You're lucky. If he were even 6 months older, this could be a different story." But Whisker wasn't wild. At least not in the way people feared. Not with Ellie. Each night, he slept beside her on the couch, head resting near her thigh, breath slow and warm. When he whimpered from the pain, she'd whisper stories into the quiet, soothing him with tales of snowy mountains and rivers that glowed under moonlight. Stories she used to tell Daniel when they camped under stars. Now, they belonged to Whisker. The days stretched and blurred. Slowly, the swelling in his paw subsided. He began limping to the window to watch birds flit by. One morning, he crept to the hearth and laid his head on Ellie's boot, just like a dog might do. But he was growing, fast. His legs were longer now, his shoulders more defined. The kitten fluff was nearly gone, replaced by a coarse coat marked with shadowy spots and bold muscle. His eyes had turned completely amber, deep, ancient, watchful. Ellie knew what that meant. He was changing, becoming who he was meant to be. One afternoon, she opened the front door wide and sat on the porch, sketchpad resting on her knees. Whisker limped out behind her, slow but steady. He stood at the edge of the steps, nose twitching at the scent of pine and damp leaves. The wind carried the distant call of crows and the sound of moving water down in the ravine. He looked back at her, and in that moment, Ellie understood. It was time. She didn't cry. Not really. But something inside her tightened like a closing hand. Still, she reached out and stroked his head one last time. "You'll always have a place here," she whispered. Whisker stepped off the porch and into the woods without a sound. The trees welcomed him like he had never left. And Ellie, sitting alone on her porch in the fading light, felt something astonishing. Not grief, not loss, but gratitude. The forest had returned her heart, in the shape of a wild thing. Some bonds are wild. Spring came early that year. The snow melted from the hollows like a soft exhale, and the river, once frozen in silence, began to sing again. Buds formed on bare branches. Crocuses pushed up through the thawing ground like promises. But Whisker did not return. At least, not the way he used to. Ellie still left food out for a while, just in case, but the plate remained untouched. The porch, once graced by wide paws and amber eyes, was still. No more scratch marks beneath the swing. No more fleeting glimpses of golden fur darting behind the woodpile. She told herself it was good, that it meant he had healed, that he had returned to the life nature intended for him. But letting go, even when it's right, never comes easy. She busied herself with photography again, hiking out to waterfalls and ridgelines, camera in hand, documenting the return of color to the woods. Each shutter click felt steadier than the last, her fingers less hesitant. Her lens no longer sought a missing piece, but instead marveled at what was right in front of it. Still, some mornings she would wake and swear she heard soft padding near the door. Some nights she left the porch light on, just in case. One evening, as pink light stretched across the sky, she sat by the fire, flipping through her sketchbook. Page after page of Whisker stared back at her, his changing shape, the wild growing behind his eyes, the silent strength that had quietly rebuilt her own. At the end of the book, She found the first drawing she'd made of him. The tiny, damp kitten curled on her woodpile, eyes half closed, unaware of the place he would soon take in her life. She smiled and closed the book. There was a photo above the fireplace now. Not of Daniel. Not anymore. That one had been gently moved to the bedroom, its frame worn soft with time and memory. The new photo showed Whisker mid-step on the porch, ears high, tail curved, amber eyes fixed on something just beyond the frame. It wasn't staged. It was real, and it was enough. One morning, Ellie sat at her small kitchen table, writing in her journal. She sipped her coffee and wrote a single line that would stay with her always. He came when I needed someone, left when he didn't need me, and that was the most honest love I've ever known. Later that day, she hiked up to the ridge that overlooked the valley. The breeze whispered through the trees like an old friend. Somewhere out there, Whisker was wild, hunting, living, free. And Ellie, she was something else too, no longer lost, no longer waiting. She was home. Sometimes, the greatest connections in life are the ones we never expect, the ones that come quietly, without permission, and leave us changed forever. Whisker didn't just cross Ellie's porch. He crossed into her heart at a time when she thought healing was impossible. And through him, she learned something vital. Love isn't about possession. It's about presence. It's about letting someone be exactly who they are and choosing to stand beside them anyway. In our lives, we often try to hold on tightly to the things that comfort us, people, moments, memories. But as Ellie discovered, the beauty of love lies not in keeping, but in honoring the freedom of what we love. So here's our challenge to you. Who or what have you tried to hold too tightly? And what might happen if you chose to trust, to release, and to believe that what's meant to return will? If you've ever been touched by a quiet moment, by the loyalty of an animal, or by the wild beauty of trust, subscribe to Paw Prints and Stories. Here, we tell the tales that remind us we're never truly alone.